Can you tell us a little bit about the process in Australia, the different strategies that have led to it actually being a referendum of people's vote? And is that something you would sort of recommend for the Faroe Islands, or what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think it's different in every country. We've been involved in this campaign for some 10 years or so now. And for many years, we had this held in the parliaments. We had a majority of MPs who were on our side of this debate. But the LGBT community are very relentless. And over the last 10 years, they have put 17 bills into our federal parliament to try and change the definition of marriage. So they use the parliament as a lever, as a mechanism all the time to try and get publicity. Even though they know it will fail, it elevates their cause. They organise parliamentary inquiries where evidence can be taken and debate held. They also went around to our state parliaments trying to get it through in a state jurisdiction. And eventually they got it through one of our territories, the Australian Capital Territory, which is equivalent to the District of Columbia in Washington, DC. But our High Court said no. It struck that down and said no, it is up to the Commonwealth Parliament to legislate. So that was a relief because it meant this could only be fought in one parliament, not in half a dozen around the country. But they just continued to be relentlessly chipping away. And eventually we saw politicians caving into this agenda and suddenly changing their mind. And that's when things got to the point in August of this year where that party room meeting was held that I mentioned, and they said, okay, enough's enough, stop bringing this to the parliament, let's take it to the people and try and resolve it that way.
Okay.
So that's the way it was working in our country. I think if you have enough politicians who are willing to hold it, I think do that. But you have to monitor the strategy.
Yeah. What's your feeling if the result of the referendum is a no to changing the definition of marriage? Will that stop the fight? Or
that's a good question. I think it will stop it for many, many years, and it will give us time. And I think we all realise that many young people have been deceived by this agenda. They've been taken in by the claims of the same-sex marriage agenda, and we need time to convince them that this is not a good idea. So I think it will buy us 5 to 10 years if we can stop it at the referendum.
Okay. It seems there's some interesting dynamics going on. In your talk, you talked about how marriage equality and some of the values that go into that idea are kind of an elite idea, or some of those concepts. Is your feeling that if it goes to a people's vote and a lot of people show up, that it will be defeated?
I think, I can't say for sure, but I do think that we've got a chance. We know from professional polling that has been done in our country that this is not a top-of-mind issue with voters. It's somewhere down 13 or 14 in terms of order of political priorities. Even the left-wing groups acknowledge this. And yet it gets constant media attention as if it's the number one priority. It's always elevated to the front of our political discourse. Yet the average voter is more concerned about the economy and jobs and all of those sort of things. So this is a very manufactured consensus. And so because of that, I think in a campaign for a people's vote, I think we have the chance to convince people. Even though the opinion polls show a majority of support, we know that support is very soft because people have not heard some of the things that we've talked about today. They've not heard the arguments about children. And we believe if we have the opportunity to get those arguments through the media filter, that people will say, wait a minute, and take a second look at this issue. So we think we have a chance.
All right. Okay, I'll just read this question. It's in English. So, would it not be possible to allow same-sex marriages without the package deal, as you called it, involving reproduction and thereby not involving children into the matter?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a very interesting question. I've thought a lot about that. But of course, no one in the same-sex community is advocating that. They are advocating for the package deal. Now, they don't talk about the package deal, but it is exactly what they want. In France, when they legislated same-sex marriage, they were going to legislate same-sex adoption and surrogacy all in the one package. And the only reason that that didn't get through is because La Manif Petous organised millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people. One march had 1 million people at it, to protest in the streets, and it frightened the government. They still went ahead with same-sex marriage, but they dropped off surrogacy and gay adoption. But President Hollande in France has said that he will revisit this and bring in surrogacy. So the only reason they stopped short in France was because of people power. In our country, the same-sex lobby are saying that they want law reform to allow greater access to assisted reproductive technology. So if they were talking about just having marriage and leaving children out of it, I think that would be a very different debate. But they are not seriously suggesting this.
Okay. Today, in many countries in the West, some of whom haven't legalized same-sex marriage, couples, homosexual couples and single women, for example, have the right to reproductive technology. So how does that sort of feed into the question of gay marriage?
Yeah, just because bad public policy has already happened doesn't make it right. And certainly in the case of Australia, yes, we have IVF for single women. We have altruistic surrogacy where no money can change hands. But we have a ban on commercial surrogacy. And we know that if marriage equality is to be legislated, altruistic surrogacy will not be sufficient for gay men. They will need access to commercial surrogacy. Lesbian women will need anonymous sperm donation. Now, public opinion is against anonymous sperm donation because we recognise that creates pain in the life of people who are denied the knowledge of their parents. It's quite ironic that some of our leading politicians who support same-sex marriage are against surrogacy, and they haven't joined the dots yet. But I know, because of my involvement in this debate over many years, the leaders of the gay lobby want surrogacy. They want these changes to assisted reproductive technology.
So they want surrogacy to be commercialised?
Absolutely. One of the leading advocates has put in he's a human rights commissioner, he's a gay man who supports same-sex marriage. He's put in one of his reports that we need further law reform in this area. The only law reform that's needed in our country is commercial surrogacy.
Okay. And can you maybe just shortly give an overview of why that might be ethically problematic?
Well, I think, as I said in my talk, lots of people recognise that surrogacy is ethically problematic. There are feminists today who are leading a global campaign to ban commercials or to ban all forms of surrogacy. I think they're right. Surrogacy can have up to 5 or 6 adults with a biological or emotional stake in the life of a child. We know this causes what's termed genetic bewilderment in the life of a child. In our country, we had a situation where our Indigenous people were living in terrible conditions, and so the government thought it was better to take children from Indigenous communities and put them in loving white families so that they could have a better life. That caused enormous pain in thousands of Indigenous families, particularly the mothers, and eventually our government gave a big apology to the Indigenous communities for taking and removing these children. We've been pointing out, well, hang on, if we legislate same-sex marriage with the package deal, which of course it has to be, we are creating another stolen generation. So this is ethically difficult. And the LGBTIQ community, whenever we raise this, they get very, very angry. They try and do everything to keep this debate away from children. But of course, this debate is all about children because redefining marriage redefines parenting. Is
your experience that that the LGBT lobby or community really tries to stay away from this particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do their friends in the media. Our media is like the Faroes, it's very one-sided on this issue. But we put out lots of media releases, we comment on this all the time. If I put a media release out where I mention the rights of the children, the media will edit those comments out and just put in some other general comment. The only time I can get the children issue raised is when I do a live interview on radio or television, and whenever I do that, I always lead with the child-centred argument because they can't edit that out. And just in the last 12 months, I've done national radio with a lesbian, with 2 lesbian presenters, and mentioned these issues, and they cannot argue. They have no argument. In fact, one of the lesbian presenters on Radio National, ABC in Australia, she has children through sperm donation, and I just respectfully made the point, but she could not rebut the argument. So I'm very confident we're on sound ground, but we just don't get the opportunity to get it through the media filter enough.
Okay. What about the question of adoption? Someone might grant, yes, there are ethical problems with surrogacy, with sperm donation, and other reproductive assistive technologies. But what about adoption? Isn't it is somehow a bad thing to deny a needing child a loving family, even if that's a gay family?
I think I would agree with that if there weren't tens of thousands of infertile heterosexual couples who could take a child. And I think where a child finds itself orphaned, a civil society has the duty to that child to try and repair what that child has lost as best as possible, and that means restoring a mother and father environment. If there were no mothers and fathers available for that child, sure, we could consider the gay couple if there's no alternative. But of course, there are tens of thousands of heterosexual couples who are infertile. I don't know what the situation is like in the Faroes, but in Australia, there's less than 300 adoptions occurring each year, and most of those are of children who have come from Africa or Asia. There just simply aren't enough children to be, not enough native-born Australian children. I think the numbers are in the 10s or 20s. It's very, very low. So, yet ironically in our country, several of our states have legalised gay adoption in the name of equality. But it's a nonsense because the numbers of children are just so few. This is about getting a political win notched up to their belt. Okay.
If we stay with maybe the ethical and scientific a little bit more, do you believe that being gay is something you're born as, or if not, why would anyone pretend to be gay, or how does that work?
This is a really important question, and it comes up a lot. So the main argument, and I didn't mention this in my talk today, but the main argument from the other side is that being gay is the same as being dark-skinned or your race. It's an immutable characteristic. And this is the way the argument's framed in our country. A very senior High Court judge said this on a panel that I was with him on just a few months ago. So it's equated with the racism argument. But the problem with that is that there is no scientific evidence to say that anyone is born gay. It just does not exist. There is no gay gene. Now there's a suggestion in science that there may be a predisposition towards homosexuality in some people, but there's not a predetermination. And there's a very big difference between the two. And so to base public policy on something that is certainly fluid, and we know it's fluid because some people are homosexual, then they change, and you've got the whole spectrum of LGBTIQ, there's a whole range of things. And sexual orientation is something which is based on behaviour rather than an innate characteristic. One's race isn't a behavioural issue, that is an innate characteristic. So I think this is a really important distinction that needs to be made in this. So if it was the case that it was akin to race, then the debate should be over. But of course, that's not the case.
Okay.
And I'll just make one other point, because people like Barack Obama, who changed his position on marriage in 2012, he formally supported marriage between a man and a woman, then he evolved. He said that there are people on our side of the debate of goodwill and we should be respected. Now, if this was about an immutable characteristic like race, why would you allow goodwill to the other side? That's like saying it's okay to be a racist. There's people of goodwill in the Ku Klux Klan. That's just not, it's a nonsense. So the race argument really is a red herring in this debate.
So do you think it's a deliberate manipulation, or just to make it kind of a racist, or equivalent to the racist debate?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said in my talk, I think this whole thing is based on a house of cards. Examination of the evidence of the claims of this political agenda just don't stack up. Whether it's this issue of the race, I mean, that's convenient, because if you can define your opponents as the moral equivalents of racists, then the debate's over. End of conversation. We shouldn't be here. And of course, that's how the media treat us, and it suppresses discussion. It's used as a big stick to shut us up.
Okay. You briefly touched on education in your talk. Can you tell us a little bit more how you think, if it becomes a fact in Australia and other places, that marriage is redefined, how will it affect education?
Yeah, well, if marriage is redefined, then sex education has to change. And we've already seen in the United States, in Massachusetts, for instance, they have produced primary school children's storybooks of King and King, two men, fairy story who got married and they're kissing, and this is available to children. So children are being indoctrinated in homosexual ideology from a very, very young age. Now, I think most parents would want to have something to say about that being taught to primary school children. I mentioned in my talk the Safe Schools program that's in Australian schools right now, and this is even before we have same-sex marriage. It is shocking. The things that I mentioned today are just part of it. I could say much more about it. Myself and my team at Australian Christian Lobbyists, we've researched this and discovered more on their websites of this material in schools. We've taken it up to politicians. Everyone is shocked. We've done media interviews on it, but again, we haven't got it to a critical mass where we've got a public outcry, but we hope by next year we can, and we will keep campaigning on this, because what they're telling young people is diabolical. Many young people go through stages of confusion about their sexuality during adolescence, but the statistics show that if you leave kids alone, most of them will work through that period of confusion. But to introduce kids to this gender theory, and it is gender theory, at a young age is deeply confusing, and I think potentially damaging, because if young people who take the advice of some of the things that I mentioned in my talk, and that causes long-term physical consequences, damages their breasts or causes infertility, then who's liable for that? In fact, we were so concerned, we engaged a lawyer to give us a professional legal advice on it, and he said that the government had a liability if a child was harmed as a result of taking the advice of this material, which is in schools now. So sex education is a real issue with this whole agenda.
Yeah, and specifically you are talking about gender reassignment, so-called changing your gender, right?
Yeah, well, this is the things I've just mentioned now. This transgender stuff is being introduced into our schools right at this minute, and it's very concerning. If a young person followed this through, and certainly the material in the school isn't advocating surgery at this point, but it's advocating these other things that I've mentioned. But later in life, someone may well do that, and that of course has big consequences. We know this is gender theory. No one can change their biology. If you are born a man, you have male chromosomes. They can do tests on your bones 100 years after you're dead, and it will tell you whether you're a man, no matter how much surgery or hormones you might have taken to try and make yourself be a woman. Now, I don't think many people realise this, and yet this is being encouraged more and more in our popular culture, and now has found its way into our school curriculums.
It's interesting to just think a little bit about how the gender theory, which is becoming more and more popular, squares with the born this way attitude.
Yeah.
They don't seem to fit together.
Yeah.
You mentioned...
He's good, this guy. He's really good.
You mentioned poverty, how family breakup is the number one way for children to end up in poverty. What sort of economic consequences do you see if same-sex marriage is legalized?
Well, I think it makes it... I think the number one priority that our Western society has is not gay marriage, it's actually rebuilding a marriage culture, because the breakdown of marriage and family because of heterosexual mismanagement of relationships has caused terrible consequences. And this research that I mentioned in Britain is very, very powerful, and I've seen similar research from the United States. Our country is not quite as bad, but we do have a big problem with family breakdown in our country. And so we have to rebuild a marriage culture. If we want to rebuild civil society and help get children out of poverty, get them into functional relationships, functional family units, then we have to be able to argue in the public square about why fathering and mothering is important, because both are important to child outcomes. If we say that fathering or mothering is irrelevant in family because we've redefined marriage, then it makes it very difficult for us to have those public discussions to talk about why a father is indispensable, why a mother is indispensable, and it makes the whole project of rebuilding marriage culture in Western civilization very, very difficult.
Yes. Do you believe that there are, and at the moment we have the LGBT lobby fighting for gay marriage. Do you believe that once that has gone through, if it does, that there are other groups that want equality for their marriage, a polygamous marriage, or something else? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a very real issue. I didn't mention it in the talk, but already in the United States, once same-sex marriage was legalised, 3 people went to a marriage registry office in the state of Montana. In New York, 3 women were in the New York Post saying they wanted to be married. These stories come up very, very regularly. And we raise this issue in the debate in Australia all the time, and we are laughed at. That's just a slippery slope. But hang on. If this is about love, if this is about equality, then why should 3 people not be allowed to have marriage equality? If you're redefining marriage to take away the gender requirement, what's so special about the numerical requirement? And they cannot answer this. In fact, we had a parliamentary inquiry a few years ago, and a question was put to a very significant leader in the gay movement. It was a former High Court judge, the fellow I just mentioned before, actually. And he said, well, look, that's not the question that's before the Parliament right now, but these things are step by step. He actually said this on the parliamentary record. I couldn't believe that he would say this. So I think it's obvious in their minds that they do see a progression, even though they try and laugh at us when we raise that now. So we have to hold them accountable. Again, the lack of investigation. I used to be a journalist. We were, at least when I was a journalist, we were taught that we should challenge the claims that are being made by people in public life. We should investigate their claims. I see no journalistic rigour applied to the LGBTIQ political agenda. It's really a worry, and one of the main foundations of any free society is a free press, and is a press that is rigorous and fearless in checking the claims. This is the first time, probably in history, that a political agenda has been allowed to sail so far without having its claims critically analysed.
Why do you think that is? Why is so much of the media on the side of the LGBT cause?
I think this has been something that is been a long march through our education system over several decades, where a worldview has been inculcated into our universities. I touched on it in my talk, the idea that truth is relative. I think people have bought into this idea that truth doesn't matter. And so once the media buys into this idea, then their capacity to investigate is greatly diminished. Their effectiveness, their usefulness is now gone. I was having a conversation in Paris with some people just a couple of nights ago. We were at a wine tasting function, and the people there weren't Christian people. And someone asked me what I did, and I said, well, I've been involved in the campaign in Australia for marriage, and I mentioned that I was concerned that children would miss out on their mother and father. He said, well, that's just an opinion. And I said, it's not actually an opinion, it's actually a reality. But this is how far smart, professional, educated people have fallen, in that they've lost their capacity to reason. Our media, our universities have lost the basic capacity to reason and to test a proposition. That's a worrying, that has huge consequences for our society to be in this predicament.
What is your position on registered or civil partnerships for homosexual couples?
Yeah. We, in Australia, and our organisation, the Australian Christian Lobby, supported the removal of discrimination against same-sex couples going back many years ago. We could see that there was this push by the LGBT community for marriage, and they based their claims on discrimination. So we said, okay, well, let's remove the discrimination but keep marriage. And so in Australia, we set up at state government level what were called registered relationships or civil partnerships, those sort of arrangements. But it didn't apply to people based on their sexual arrangements. It was their domestic arrangements. So any domestic codependent could avail themselves of a civil partnership or a registered relationship. It could be two women who live together as sisters or friends. They were domestic, and if a same-sex couple happened to be in that arrangement, we didn't care. It's not our business what they do in the bedroom, but if it helps remove discrimination against the way they live their life, they could get a civil partnership. So we supported that, and that was all put in place some years ago. But of course, the gay lobby didn't stop there. They want to capture this word marriage. So it's important to know that in Australia, there is no discrimination against same-sex couples. It's been gone for years. And yet they want to claim this issue of marriage because that's important to them, because if they can claim marriage, it means the church is no longer allowed to speak the truth about marriage and to teach that. They can then use anti-discrimination law to silence us. And that is what I think the real agenda is.
Mm. Yeah, and if we can go further into the question of discrimination, how do you defend a baker, for example, denying his services to someone simply because he disapproves of their lifestyle? Isn't it unethical to do so?
This is a really important question. I think if the baker or the florist was saying to someone, I will not serve you because you're gay, I think there's a problem with that. If I was a baker, I will probably serve people who are adulterous, who are liars, who are cheating, who are doing other things that Christians would consider as sinful behaviour. I think the difference, though, is when someone comes to you and says, could you please use your gifts and talents, your creative abilities, to celebrate a view of marriage that is in violation of your conscience, I think that is a reasonable thing for someone to say no to. So you're not saying no to them because they're gay, you're saying, no, I don't want to use my creative talents as a florist or as a photographer, my artistic abilities, to celebrate something which I think is not true. It's a violation of my conscience. And that's what several people in the United States have done very recently, and also Ash's Bakery in Northern Ireland. And there have been big court cases, big fines. The florist Baronelle Stutman in Washington State has lost her case. She is facing the repossession of her business. It's gone to appeal. But this is terrible, that people should have to face this. And it's not because gay couples can't get services somewhere else. There are plenty of business who are prepared to offer those services. So it's not like they have nowhere to go. But we think they should be tolerant and allow people who have a conscientious objection to gay marriage to be able to live that out in public and live it out in the way that they conduct their businesses. But of course, there is no tolerance for this.
Can you address maybe the question of whether this sort of dispute should be regulated by the courts and by law, or should the free market take care of it?
I think the free market should take care of it, but the law should accommodate people's religious freedom. And I'm talking about situations where our side, might have lost, as they've lost in America. So in America, where the courts, in a very undemocratic way, imposed gay marriage on the whole 50 states of the United States, there should be accommodations made for people's religious freedom so that they are allowed to express that. Under the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it actually says that people have a right to religious freedom, and it defines religious freedom in a way that says that it's the right to manifest your religion in public. It's not just a private affair. Even the UN acknowledges that religion is not just something that happens at church on Sunday. Religion is something that people live out in their day-to-day lives. And of course, that is in the way that you exercise your conscience in your business. And people should be allowed to have that accommodated in law, and that's what our friends in the United States are now fighting for, now that they've lost the debate there.
Okay, final question. What does the future hold for churches and other dissenting groups and individuals and their liberty if this change goes through?
I think the future is very bleak, to be really, really honest. If this change goes through, then anti-discrimination law will be used, and it is being used in our country, America, in the UK, to silence different views on marriage. I think it's going to be very difficult for Christian schools to teach the truth about marriage to their students. I think you will see many Christians compromising and thinking, well, it's better just to be silent and we just go underground with this. I think that's a terrible position where we have to live in fear because the government has redefined something which is so basic as marriage. I think it's important that we speak now before it's too late.
Thank you so much, Lyle.
Thanks, Arnie.